Okay, everyone, I think we'll make a start. Thanks so much for being here. And thanks so much to George Rayson, who's joining us from Cork, where he's just completing a Irish Research Council postdoc in Italian studies. George came to Italian and came to Dante as a student of English. We'll talk about that in just a second, at York. He then went to do a master's and a PhD in Cambridge, where he studied with Heather Webb, and he's going to tell us a little bit about his PhD research, I think, and his broader project in just a minute. And then he's gone on to Cork to complete this sort of postdoctoral research and to work on publishing as a book his PhD research. What we thought we'd do just for like a couple of minutes to begin with is just have a little kind of dialogue conversation about how you came to Dante, how you think that's informed how you read and how you see and how you teach Dante, and then that will kind of segue hopefully nicely into your presentation. So so you came to Dante as a student of English, and you actually had to study some literature or some culture in a foreign language. Yeah. So what did that look like, reading Dante as a student of English in Italian?
So we obviously it was a paired text, so the paired translation. So there was the Italian on one side and the English on the other. So it was kind of, you could sort of do a bit of maths, kind of like, or using, you had to use quite a lot of kind of logic to kind of work out what words you're not really kind of doing these instinctively. You're not really, you don't know anything yet, so you kind of have to start very, very basic and kind of almost guess what word equates to what. But then you end up that gives you kind of quite in a granular sense, quite a strong sense of the particularities of language, and it makes you pay quite close attention to what words are being used, and then that has really informed what I've done since.
Yeah, because I think it's really interesting. You came to it as a student of English, yet your work is very kind of focused on the linguistic particularity.
Yeah, exactly. In Italian, and I think what helped was the course at York, which was brilliant in general, was very much about kind of finding your own voice and learning how to read literature, all literature, but poetry specifically, well, and engaging at the coalface with the text. And that skill, I think, is super important, but also is transferable across languages. So once, obviously, you're going to make some mistakes, and there's going to be some things that you're kind of fudging a little bit, but you can, when you're reading the Italian, even if you've not quite got the mastery of it yet, you still can pay attention to sound and rhythm, repetition. And when you're learning as well in tandem the grammar, you can also pick up on where the verbs are, what type of, what conjugations are being used, what tenses are being used, and what tenses in conjunction with each other are being used.
Yeah, and I think you said to a student yesterday, you sort of used the poem a bit like a linguistic handbook in a way.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. That's how I kind of learnt basic Italian to understand Dante, and then use Dante to then learn Italian, basically.
So you go around speaking 14th century Florentine.
My friend has a list of George-isms, which are basically just words from the Commedia, which I use in everyday speech, and they're not. Nobody says.
Okay.
Like, I don't know.
And what was it that sort of excited you about this particular text in the Commedia that made you go on to do?
That's a really good question. I think it was in part the language. Obviously, there's just so much going on. Like this, and it's so beautiful as well. Especially Paradiso is my favorite, and still not quite got it yet. But that's a brilliant challenge, I find. But also it's the infinite variety. I think there's just the whole universe is contained in that, and it's not a cosmology necessarily. It's a universe of things. It's an earthly universe as well. It's a universe of objects and matter. So that it can almost take you anywhere. Basically, you could write about Dante and anything almost within reason. But there's like clocks, there's birds, there's.
That's too very specific.
I know. I don't know, regrets, whatever. Lots of things.
Brilliant. And I was going to ask you to think, because there's this very sort of there's a sort of commonplace, isn't there, where Dante is described as father of the Italian language. And I'm thinking, as you know, quite a lot about kind of Dante as kind of father of the nation.
Yeah.
And that and how that sort of conditions a little bit how we think about him and how we think about what medieval Italy was and how it maybe flattens something very complicated. But how does that expression of father of the Italian language, how is it useful and how is it problematic?
I think it's wrong, but it is useful. And it's useful because I think it actually does tell us about trends in literary historiography and criticism and things. So it can tell us what it tells us often more about how we conceive Dante than about Dante himself. But actually, I also think it does tell us something about Dante, and that is, I think, rather than mapping the father of the Italian language onto Dante, I think there's something happening in the poem that allows for that construction to happen. That this synthesis, so this is what I'm going to talk a bit about today, is the plurilingualism of the Commedia, this kind of almost infinite variety of different languages from different spheres of influence, different languages, different social practices. That synthesis of those is also kind of in a key of power as well. There's a power dynamic, and it's to the tune of a Tuscan vernacular. So they are brought together, I think. This is why I would call it the plurilingualism and ideology. It's something that it's a kind of political principle as much as it is just a statement of variety. So I think there's something happening in the text that is pulling those things under an umbrella of language. So I don't think it's like totally our invention. I think there's something from within the text that's caused it.
Fantastic. I will let you, on that note,
cool. Okay.
Talk. But yeah, thank you very much to George.
Okay. Thank you, Tristan. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And thanks to Bristol as well for hosting me. It's been really nice couple of days, actually. And thank you as well to the SIS for sponsoring this. So today, I'm going to talk to you about my research, which I guess I've just sort of touched on a bit, and it's predominantly been focused on Dante's relationship with language, and in particular I'm drawn to the poetic effects created by choosing particular words. What responses, whether affective or critical, do certain words stimulate in us when we read them in a poetic context? I'm convinced personally by the notion that all words in poetic works are chosen deliberately. The poem creates a kind of delicate ecosystem where each individual part is related to the whole. But there are some words that stick out more than others. And the professor of poetry at Oxford, A.E. Stallings, has an excellent lecture on this, where she discusses how certain words raise the stakes of a poem. My doctoral thesis was about a particular family of such words which definitively raise the stakes. Hapax legomena. These are words which are used only once, either in a particular text or in a corpus of text. And my thesis discussed hapax legomena within the Commedia, so words which are only used once within the confines of the work. So in a shorter lyric work, for instance, there will be one or two words which might strike you more than others, but in a shorter work, it is likely that a lot of the words will technically be hapax, unless there is some sort of deliberate repetition being used. But in a longer epic work, like the Commedia, hapax are a far more useful tool for tracing these kind of emphases. But what kind of emphases are we talking about? What exactly are the stakes of poetry? Does poetry matter? Obviously, yes, it does. But how exactly do we describe the effects the poetic word has on us when we read it? Is this useful criticism? And how do we make criticism out of this process? How can we externalize the process of responding to poetry such that it is not just an infinity of subjective responses? How do we square feeling and poetry and thinking about poetry? What I want to show you today is that Dante, as not just a great writer of poetry, but a great thinker about poetry too, was preoccupied with the stakes of his language. Not just in the abstract, but down to individual word choice. So first I'll just introduce my research a little more, and then I'm going to talk about the terms by which the genre of the Commedia was understood according to the terms of the poem itself, and what that means for the language of the poem, first in Inferno, and then in Paradiso. So this was my thesis, with a particularly snazzy title, as they usually are. Dante's Hapax Legomena in the Commedia, a study of poetic singularity. Really rolls off the tongue, that one. And in this, I kind of I examined the more than 2,000 words which are used only once within the confines of the poem itself. And this is not the only definition of hapax. So again, kind of going back to what Tristan was just asking me about, the kind of the father of the Italian language. In the Italophone context, a hapax usually means a word that is only used once in the Commedia and in no other contemporary text. So that, if you're looking at those type of hapax, you're doing something slightly different. You're doing you're analysing the contribution that the text is making to the literature. This is not what I was interested in. I was interested in what using a word only once within a text, what kind of emphases, what kind of poetic effects that creates. Obviously, there's more than 2,000 of these words, so not all of them are going to be relevant. And that is why I think about hapax more as a kind of compositional practice, a kind of method, is what I was trying to isolate, rather than kind of isolated sites of interest. So what's interesting as well, I guess, what I was kind of the method that I was kind of drawn towards was how hapax kind of are kind of singular, represent a kind of singular attention. So they are from the perspective of composition. So the poet kind of drawing our attention into one particular thing, and us having that attention drawn. So where is our eye drawn? What words strike us? So there's that kind of singular focus, but then they also exemplify the plurilingualism, the kind of variety of language, because there's more than 2,000 words used only once. This is I would say a good legend, a good kind of metonymy for the variety, the plurilingualism of the Commedia. So you've got a kind of tension there between singular focus and variety. And this is kind of something I want to explore throughout the talk today, as a kind of as the plurilingualism of the Commedia as being a variety within limits, a kind of almost not an infinity of difference, but something with control, with careful selection, with focus. Because plurilingualism does not mean choosing without thought. It means that there are limitations involved. This is a slight. I'm going to just give you a slight aside. A. Stallings also wrote a collection of poetry, composed a collection of poetry called Hapax, and this is the preface. I found this quite interesting, which is that according to this, I'm not a classicist, so I need to actually check this properly. But that the first use of the word hapax, which is there, I believe, is used when Circe is describing the journey of Odysseus down into the afterlife. So literally, the journey of a living man going into the underworld is hapax, right? The Commedia's plot is a kind of hapax, which I found very interesting. I mean, I don't really, obviously, it isn't a hapax because more than one person has done it, because so is Aeneas and so is St. Paul. However, I think it represents the plot of being such an incongruity between being alive and being dead has a kind of stylistic representation of, I would say, strangeness, another type of incongruity, something that privileges difference. That's a slightly, I don't know, this is still slightly, I'm slightly sketching while I kind of think about that, but I found that quite interesting. Just in case you're wondering why it might seem as a random technique to focus on of all the types of technique that you might associate with plurilingualism, I thought that might be some sort of justification. Anyway, plurilingualism, what is it? So it's a variety of language, and it was a term popularized by Gianfranco Contini in the 50s to describe Dante's Commedia in opposition to a monolinguismo, so like a language of one, of say Petrarch. Now, Petrarchan people might say that's a little bit reductive. So but the idea is that instead of there being a kind of massive variety of language, there is kind of a kind of shrunken kind of corpus, a small corpus of words, and you try and tease out as much meaning as you can, as much kind of ambiguity as you can from the smaller amount of words. In Dante, it's a plurilinguismo, so it's a greater variety. But plurilingualism would not have been considered as such in the medieval period, so we've got to do a bit of due diligence there. The German philologist Erich Auerbach wrote that Dante composed the Commedia in the style of a sermo humilis, So a kind of humble, plain style that the church fathers would have seen as appropriate for the representation of sacred things, for instance, in the Bible. And there is also a key point of difference between this and the genera dicendi. So these are the kind of the levels of style in the classical model from Cicero, etc. So the high level of style would have been used in the composition of a tragedy, and then there's the middle style, which is satire, and then the low style, which is used for composing a comedy. And even though Dante refers to his work as a comedy, and it is a comedy, that's the name, we also don't want to confuse this kind of humbleness, the sermo humilis, with a kind of just with a lowliness, or rather, we don't want to get too bogged down in the classical levels of style. Although, of course, Dante, as we will see, does represent pretty lowly and scurrilous things. Yet, as Boransky demonstrates here, the kind of lowliness is not without paying due diligence to what is included and excluded. So there's a sermo humilis that Boransky highlights here. There's a kind of focus on, there's a kind of thinking about what's in and out. It's not an automatic kind of obedience to the levels of style. It's not a conventional exercise in the low style. That's what he says. So there's something more complicated than a simple separation of styles, and maybe the sermo humilis is the way to go when trying to characterize it in a medieval terminology, if we don't want to use plurilingualism. So, as I said, Dante does refer twice to his own work as a commedia, and this particular section might explain again why the kind of classic separation of styles might not be super appropriate. You know, there's a consideration of what is and isn't to be included. There's an anxiety over saying the wrong thing. There's a self-reflexivity that kind of undoes an automatic kind of fidelity to a certain level of style. You know, is it so easily categorizable? So here he defines the genre of this poem, and in the second, so we've got two cases of commedia, and then in the kind of, and these are all also within pretty quick succession in the Inferno. He also defines the tragedy. This is Virgil talking about his Aeneid, and he calls it l'alta mia tragedia. So that is Virgil calling his Aeneid firmly and placing it firmly in the kind of the high tragic style of the classic separation of styles. What is interesting here is that in the second example of Commedia in Inferno 21, which comes pretty soon off the back of Tragedia, so Tragedia coming towards the end of Inferno 20, and Commedia coming right at the start of 21, he literally says, "Che la mia commedia cantar non cura." He's thinking about things that are not included. It's not just an unthinking come one, come all. There's a careful application of thought. There are things that don't make their way in. And this kind of process of representing this represents a kind of process of careful selection, and would be applicable to thinking about hapax as well as products of careful selection. So it's also important to remember where we are in the poem. So here, these are all within 6 cantos of each other, and that is all within the 8th circle of hell, which is malebolge, or which deals with fraud. So this is the longest section of the whole of hell. And it deals with fraud, and it's also very meta-literary. So these are not unusual, I would say, meta-literary kind of points that are being made here. In the first instance, di questa commedia lettor ti giuro, la la la. So he's swearing on the notes of his comedy in the description of Geryon, who is a monster who takes Dante and Virgil down into the 8th circle of hell, down into Malebolge, and he's often seen as a figure of fraud itself, or as a kind of literary antitype for the comedy. Because at this point, there's a great anxiety, I feel, in this section of the poem about fictionality and its relationship with fraud. What is the fundamental difference between fiction and lying? And this kind of plays out in an anxiety over what the poet should be including and what weight his words have. So what does it mean for him to choose words within the remit of a commedia? What will happen to the afterlife of those words? What effect will they have on other people? He doesn't want to be a false prophet. And the false prophets are those which are punished in Inferno 20. So really the stakes kind of couldn't be higher. So according to, yes, so as we saw, according to Baranski, the Commedia is not the same as a classical separation of styles. Dante is doing something quite different. He often kind of reworks classical norms. You know, he's kind of reworking the tragedia. He's kind of trying to overcome it with his own commedia. These two things are kind of in tension. This is found throughout his work. So in the Vita Nuova, for instance, he repurposes the term poeta, which had always been used to refer to classical poets, and he applies it to vernacular poets for the first time. So there's a kind of a pretty regular reworking of classical norms. So whether Dante is getting rid of kind of the separation of styles altogether, or is making something new out of it, kind of repurposing a commedia for his own ends, what is clear is that the style of the commedia should be characterized as a process of careful inclusivity. Baranski makes the important point too that Dante scholars have often exercised a certain squeamishness about certain aspects of Dante's style. And I want to talk about them now because I think they go some way to explaining why it is so important not to consider poetic word choice just in terms of necessity, i.e. governed by strict rules of genre. It's important to get out of the narrow boxes which genera dicendi might provide. Something more complex is going on, often in terms of pleasure, and that is not necessarily sexual. So here we have some quite explicit scatological terms. Again, all kind of all of this is grouped into the Malebolgia, into the 8th circle of fraud. So in 18, 21, and 28. So merda is not a hapax, it's used twice. But in the second example, in Inferno 28, which is where the sowers of discord are mutilated, including the Prophet Muhammad, very controversially. In this example, what I would draw your attention to is that merda is used in a kind of circumlocution, and antonomasia would be the kind of the Greek rhetorical term for the bowel. So he says, and the sad sack that makes shit, right? Instead of saying the one word for bowel, he uses 6 words and includes the word merda. It's a kind of rhetorical device that allows him, instead of just directly naming the organ, it's a rhetorical device that permits him to work the word merda in. It doesn't have to be there. He's made it in there. Similarly, merdose, here, that is a hapax. It's also a first attestation, so it doesn't exist in any previous text before the Commedia in Italian. It's very rare as well. It's not really used very much afterwards, maybe 6 or 7 times. And that really does suggest that it's raising the stakes. And that would suggest to me that there's something, you know, that he's again trying to work something in. This is not a common word. This is something rare, difficult, and new. Culo and trombetta are also hapax. Can you actually see the bottom? Is that okay? Yeah, okay. Again, this is at the close of Canto 21. So this is the last word. Is a fart. So, and he had made of his arse a trumpet. Right? That's the thing that closes the canto. That's always significant. Fabian Alfie points out that this construction, ed egli aveva del cul fatto trombetta, which is also a circumlocution, it's also an antonomasia. It doesn't just say he had farted, it says of his arse he had made a trumpet. Right? It's also an indirect syntax. This construction is in the pluperfect tense. So Alfie's idea is that the usual kind of imperfect tense, which rules the narrative description, so he did this, he did that, blah, 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 in a kind of relatively linear order. This pluperfect tense, he had done something, doubles back to describe a preceding action, right, that was not included in that usual narrative procedure, effectively meaning that Dante is making sure to work the far in. Right? It doesn't follow a logical narrative procedure. It comes logically before, but is put into a position of prominence. And it closes the canto, so that's always emphatic. My point here with these examples is that this kind of circumlocutory syntax and grammar is in a kind of productive tension with the directness of the vocabulary. This is, you know, he's not pulling any scatological punches. The two work in tandem. The circumlocutory syntax, in fact, enables the vocabulary to be cast as products of playfulness, not necessity. I think I'm going to give you one more example about this kind of lack of necessity before moving on to Paradiso. So again, we have the final word of a canto. This is the canto 21, canto 20, sorry, and it's the word introque. And this is quite an important kind of discussion of why certain words would and wouldn't be included. And it's also obviously a hapax in the Commedia. So what's interesting about this word introque is that it is used also in the De Vulgari Eloquentia, which was preceded the Commedia, and the De Vulgari Eloquentia was a Latin treatise written about how to compose properly vernacular verse. It's unfinished, so rather than kind of what we would maybe expect, kind of like with your usual kind of prescriptive poetic text, in which you're told how to write poetry properly, it doesn't really get that far. There was supposed to be a whole chapter on rhyme that never got finished. So what we have mostly is the construction of an ideal vernacular language, a volgare illustre. So this means that there's a lot of exclusion of different regional languages spoken across Italy. So he kind of makes a kind of, Stephen Bottrell calls it a dialectologist's holiday across Italy, kind of collecting and rejecting all the different regional languages, kind of in the name of trying to find one overarching, illustrious vernacular. And that also includes rejecting certain words that he deems as unsuitable for the composition of poetry, including introque. So here Dante uses this kind of example to dismiss his own native Florentine tongue. Introque forms a kind of reason for that rejection, and it's far from unusual. But this word is then used in the Commedia, so that happens on several occasions. So something like mamma is rejected in the DVE, but then comes back into the Commedia several times. Babbo as well, and this kind of fits the characterization of the DVE as kind of exclusionary, and the Commedia as inclusive, and that is worth challenging, but we'll just leave it there for now. What we can see here is that introque is kind of understood, though, as kind of a street talk, colloquial, right? And it's not just from Dante. Guido da Pisa also conceived of introque as a kind of colloquial street talk word, and there is something kind of casual to it. So they're kind of "Si mi parlava e andavamo introque." So he spoke to me, so Virgil spoke to me, and we kept walking at the same time. It's kind of walking and talking. There's a kind of casual kind of colloquiality to it. And this is kind of actually quite unusual, because often under the guidance of Virgil, Dante is directed to focus particularly on something, be that Virgil's words, or the words of a soul, or the appearance of a soul, often within reason. So he's often chastised as well for spending too long, kind of tarrying with the wrong people. So there's a lot of kind of direction of attention, which isn't really happening here. Meanwhile means it means divided attention. Introque meaning meanwhile, that necessitates a divided attention, two things happening simultaneously, rather than direct and kind of laser-like focus. And we're at here, as I mentioned before, at a moment of transition when Dante is thinking about the genre of his poem, but importantly too, about the weight that his words might have within that genre. That he should then decisively include a previously rejected word, and one that is native to him, one that kind of bespeaks a kind of colloquiality, I think that is significant. And I would rather suggest that rather than this kind of being an example of all inclusivity, that it kind of shows a more subtle change of priorities, where lexical choice can be an act of pleasure or leisure, where walking and talking with a friend and kind of chatting has a place. So that will lead me now on to Paradiso. Where lexical pleasure is most obviously theorized, and in fact, Paradiso is also where Dante most clearly thinks about language. He meets Adam, as in the Adam from the Garden of Eden, in the 8th heaven of the fixed stars, and Adam divines through his his heavenly vision that Dante wants to know about the language he spoke when he was in the Garden of Eden, when Adam was in the Garden of Eden, and Adam says that his Hebrew spoken in Eden changed over time. And we'll come back to this. But he says here in Paradiso that the Hebrew he spoke in the Garden of Eden is not the same as the Hebrew spoken by Christ. For example, on the cross with El here, El si chiamo poi, which is which is a citation from the bit in the Bible where Christ's on the cross and is saying, "My Lord, why have you forsaken me?" This leads to a reflection on all human language. And because it's made by humans and is the product of faulty human reason, it must be liable to change. It cannot be eternal. And this doesn't mean language in general, but specific iterations of a language will decay and change with time. What is interesting is this change is linked to pleasure. Piacere uman che rinovella. Secondo che va bella. It's according to what pleases us. Pleasure is at the root of human language. And to demonstrate just how significant Dante's construction of linguistic pleasure is, we need to go back again to the De Vulgari Eloquentia. In the De Vulgari Eloquentia, Dante explains the story of the Tower of Babel. This is a biblical story, and in case you're not aware, I'll just explain it again briefly. The people of the earth got together and decided to build a tower up to heaven. And they were able to do this because they all spoke the same language. This is the story as it goes. Under the guidance of Nimrod, they were able to communicate together to build a tower to heaven, and this so affronted God that he smote them, and he smote them by making sure that they could never talk to each other again. And thus was born all the different languages of the world. Thus was born multilingualism as a punishment. That's important. Multilingualism as punishment. Those who did not participate in the construction of the Tower of Babel were allowed to keep their Hebrew as a reward for not participating. So the story goes as it is repeated in the De Vulgari Eloquentia. Dante then, in Paradiso, very significantly changes his mind. Now, Hebrew, in the construction of Paradiso, as it's construed by Adam, now Hebrew also changes from when Adam spoke it to when Christ spoke it. And this is, Barolini puts it very well, this is her point that linguistic difference, multilingualism, is not a biblical punishment anymore in Paradiso, but it's necessary to how human language functions. It's not, basically, Dante kind of defangs the punishment associated with Babel that is in the De Vulgari Eloquentia, and now it's something productive and positive, where linguistic difference is driven by pleasure. So one of the most famous kind of examples of kind of linguistic play, or I guess poetic play, in the Paradiso is this passage here, also from Paradiso 26. Le fronde onde s'infronda la 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 la. It's kind of got this generative kind of playful beauty to it, and it kind of comes back in a more serious key at the end of the canto here. The serious message that l'uso di mortale come fronda in ramo. So human things are like a leaf on a branch, and they will then fall, and thus the cycle of life continues. Showing that play and joy in language, like this, is only there because we know it's going to expire, because it's got a sell-by date. Okay, it kind of releases us from the kind of from a certain amount of pressure. You can enjoy life because you know it's going to end, right? If that's true, though, how do we end up choosing the right words? Or what does Dante tell us? Not very much. He says, on the face of it at least, he says, ma così o così. So, what the language looks like exactly, così or così, on the surface, kind of sounds like it doesn't really matter because it's all going to die anyway. It doesn't really go into specifics, right? He doesn't name a specific form that each will take. It's così or così. I wonder, though, if one così is exactly the same as the other. I mean, they're spaced apart. The lines progress according to a hendecasyllabic rhythm. There is a linear progression of the line. Is there really such a thing as repetition in the poem? Really? Is it not productive as well to think about kind of pronunciation, or how kind of the oral enactment according to the rhythm of the line? You know, how somebody else pronounces it might be different from how one person pronounces it, might be different from somebody else's. Essentially, how do we think about the afterlife? Again, I used that word before. The kind of the afterlife of the poetic word. And this was, I think, really weighed on Dante, because he knows we can make stuff with language, that language is or can be performative in the original linguistic sense, not just made up. Performative meaning I say and therefore it exists. It's the afterlife of the word is not always within the speaker's control. It can mutate and metastasize into something else. One così may not end up equaling necessarily the other. And I want to draw you to what Adam says before this main speech. He says that he knows what Dante is going to ask about the idioma che usai e che fei, the language that I used and I made. Logically, Adam would have to have made the language first and then used it. And this is a rhetorical technique called hysteron proteron, in which the logical order of events is represented syntactically in reverse order. So he puts "fei" in made in rhyme position, stressing the orality of making. He shows us that language can be non-linear grammatically. We can play around with it, and shows that when you say something out loud, when you make an oral language, it becomes much more liable to change. Spoken languages, we know, are more unstable than written ones. And I think Dante is aware of this, or rather the consequence that he knows how we use language exactly can have consequences. I mean, taking you back to Malebolge and the relationship between fictional language and fraud, that is a very high stakes discussion for the Commedia, right? What's the difference between literature and lying? And with this, as with all things, there comes a reckoning in Paradiso. It's all fun and games in Paradiso. And Dante also wants to show us how important treating language seriously is. So here we have Thomas Aquinas in Paradiso 13, scholastic theologian, near contemporary of Dante. He's a character in Paradiso, and he warns us to be careful with our theological argumentation, to approach it with piombo a piedi, with lead on our feet, to approach it slowly. But it's also how we use our words. Al sì e al no, che tu non vedi. If you don't know the answer to something, or you don't see particularly the right path yet, whether you say yes or no, that process of kind of groping around for the right word must be done carefully, right? I've also highlighted the word distinzione here, distinction, because when you make a distinction between two things in the scholastic world practice, you show their differences, right, to better understand them, right? And you maybe make a choice between one and the other, between yes and no. But by showing their differences, you also allow both to coexist at the same time. And perhaps this is the key point about the language of Paradiso. The language is messy and fluid. There is difference, but also we are encouraged to make a choice. At the end, in some way, we must make a choice. And whether that choice is by dint of necessity, I'm not so sure, as my final example will show before we finish. So I'm going to turn again to Paradiso 26, but this time not to Adam's disquisition on language. In the first half of the canto, Dante is blinded and undergoes an examination on Caritas from St. John. This here is how the return of Dante's sight is described. And the word I want to focus on to close is the word quisquilia, and it is a joy to pronounce. It's my favorite of them all. It doesn't really get any better than that. Quisquilia is obviously a hapax in the poem, a Latin word which Chiavaci Leonardi translates as piccolezza bazzecola, that is a trifle, but in the context of its use in Paradiso means literally an eye blemish cleared from the pilgrim's sight by Beatrice. A more technical explanation comes from Benvenuto da Imola, the 14th century commentator to the Comedy, who locates the word in a specifically agrarian context. And such specificity explains the fact that the word seemingly only has one attestation in vernacular Italian prior to the Commedia, in the vernacularization of Bartolomeo Anglico's De Proprietatibus Rerum by Vivaldo Balcaser. It's not even used in the main body of the text, but as a rubricated heading, as Paolo Manni explains. It's Capitol delle Quisquilie, and this comes after a large section, as Paolo Manni has demonstrated, a large section of the text dedicated to plants and trees. And as Manni argues, the attestation of Quisquilia in Balcaser corroborates the sense of the word given by the Tilio, the Tesoro Linguistico dell'Italiano delle Origini, which is the waste matter from the threshing of grains. Quisquilia is also, according to Hollander, a hapax in the Bible, used at Amos, in Amos 8:6, and indicating the chaff separated from grain, for the selling of which God admonishes the Israelites. And this discovery embeds the word further in a technical language of agrarian labor, as it refers to a kind of very specific practice. And I would always kind of argue this kind of material history of labor has some kind of metatextual kind of valence. And this is of a piece with another image in Paradiso 26, as the pilgrim's answers to John will be through a più angusto vaglio, a narrower sieve, where angusto and vaglio are also both hapax in the Commedia. The sieve image that Dante applies to filtering out the best words in the De Vulgare Eloquentia, remember that, is also echoed here in Cribro, blah, 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 blah. So the sieve comes back. What we are forced to reckon with the fact that Dante also applies, and this is why I mean we need to be careful distinguishing between the exclusionary nature of the DVE and the inclusionary nature of the Commedia. So we are forced to reckon with the fact that Dante is also applying a kind of precision poetics to the Commedia. There's the plurilingualism again with limits. The word quisquilia is used in the context, which is also important, of Beatrice's bettering of Dante's sight, as the Encyclopedia Dantesca entry declares. So it's the kind of it alludes to the progressive refining of the intellective faculties of the poet, and gradually Beatrice kind of prepares him for a higher perception of God. The word is therefore used as part of Beatrice's labour of tempering and perfecting the sight of the pilgrim in preparation for what is to come. This careful labour also bespeaks a pleasure in the nuts and bolts of labour in general, something which Dante prized, and Carla Millet speaks about Dante's fascination with and privileging of the technological advancements of his age. She says something along the lines of he has more interest in how the ships are built than what the ships themselves do, or the image of a ship is less interested in that than how it's made. This is conveyed to us as well, who have to do some hard graft, some kind of etymological excavation to find out just exactly what this word means. And yet for both us and for Dante, there is something about the phonics of the word that speaks to us. The word invites pleasure even in the formation of its very sounds. Manni says that the word is avvalorata e messa in rilievo dalla posizione in rima. The rhyme position of the word engages these phonic pleasures. And it is possible that, as this hapax catches our eye, or rather ear, on the page of the Commedia, it could also have jumped out as a strange and singular usage to Dante's ear in his reading of the Bible. The hapax status of a word thus forges a particularly potent covenant between poet and reader, as the affective responses of both are stimulated by the same singular word. The significance of quisquilia is that it is fundamentally a paean against necessity. In the context of its use, Dante has been engaged in a theological examination, but we already know that he is going to pass it. This evasion of teleology finds its representation in quisquilia. Every quisquilia is removed from Dante's sight, so his participation in heavenly joy can increase. But the word still lodges in our eyes. We can't quite rid ourselves of it. It is as much about the process as the result, a way of thinking which underwrites the lexicon of the Sido della Lauda, and as such Dante has to thank the quisquilia as much as be grateful for its departure. Quisquilia is not selected to directly communicate a present reality. Rather, it enriches an absent reality, that of when the blemishes were present. And in selecting it, the poet demands we read words not only for their communicative efficacy, but also for their phonic pleasures. An irony of the word referring to something absent is that it's got the word qui in it twice, which is meaning here, like it's saying I am here, very literally. But the importance of quisquilia is amplified by the fact that, through its shared rhyme, it interacts with another section of the poem, with powerful reverberances throughout the Commedia, the episode of Ulysses in Canto 26 of Inferno. In a striking vertical correspondence, these two passages from identically numbered cantos of Inferno and Paradiso also share a rhyme that is unique to only those passages, the rhyme in Ilia, here Sibilia, Milia, Vigilia. This shared vertical correspondence, this rhyme, has not, as far as I'm aware, been pointed out by any previous critical attempts to read the two canti together, but you can't really say that with Dante studies because it's impossible. But I don't know, I haven't found anything yet. Such a vital shared commodity allows quisquilia to shoot its reverberances back down to hell. What is Ulysses doing here? He's using his rhetoric, his words, to achieve a particular goal, to convince his shipmates to accompany him on one last mission to the ends of the earth. Quisquilia is quite the opposite, always encouraging pleasure for its own sake, against necessity. Quisquilia, as waste matter, asks us to go back to Inferno and read those waste words, if you remember, the merda, in a new light, as not there narrowly because of the demands of style, but potentially because of a surplus of pleasure. The work of encouraging lexical pleasure is a fundamental constitutive principle of the entire poem. Thank you.
So much, George, for that wonderful talk, and taking us from the kind of broader questions at the heart of your research into a much more detailed and extremely rich interpretation of some specific examples and such. Yeah, fascinating.